It is a rare opportunity in the automotive world to get two companies like Porsche and GM to pit their most capable sports cars against one another on track. This collaboration goes beyond rivalry. It's about celebrating sports cars and uniting car enthusiasts, engineers, and the car community as a whole. As we set aside the next 40 minutes, the GT3 and the Z06 serve as a reminder of what is possible when you design a car with passion and purpose.
You can't do a comparison without discussing the merits of the interior and the exterior of these cars, which we're going to touch on briefly. Jack's going to discuss his beloved Z06, while I'm going to nitpick the GT3, so let's get started, Jack.
The C8 Z06. Well, this definitely looks like a supercar, particularly in 3LZ guys with the Z07 package with its giant carbon fiber wing and carbon fiber front canards. My fear is, much like Mark's hairline in his 20s, this is a here and now styling exercise. This is far from classically designed on the exterior, and that philosophy of trying to wow you with edges and materials definitely carries over to the interior space. This car is maxed out with carbon fiber wheels, carbon fiber exposed on the roof, and everywhere else that it can be is a relative bargain when you compare these two cars. This is maxed out a little bit over $160,000, and that's of course before the dealer gets a hold of you. But the one thing I will say is you can get a Z06 base, assuming you can get it at MSRP, in the low $100,000 range, which is definitely something you cannot do with the GT3. And GM is trying to wow you with carbon fiber and leather and aluminum everywhere. The seats in this car are the optional competition seats, and they are far less aggressive than the carbon buckets in the GT3, but I will say you don't sit anywhere as low, and you definitely have less visibility in this car. You have a much smaller front windshield, and you essentially can see nothing behind you. In fact, when it comes to storage in this car, despite having a frunk and a trunk, the reality is there's less usable space in this cabin. The other thing I will bring up is this square steering wheel. It is not something I particularly enjoy using, and there is absolutely nothing for the passenger to hold on to. But with that, I think it's time for Mark to wow you with a GT3.
The GT3, much like most of the 911s of the 992 generation, there's one thing I will say. This is the best 911 interior of the modern era because everything is consolidated and easy to use. There's mechanical switches and levers everywhere where you need them, and no touch-sensitive crap anywhere. They've moved the drive controller to the steering wheel, and this feels like a classic focused driver's car interior space. There is not a lot of BS. The con of all of that is, unlike the Z06 where you can get leather interior and all the fancy pants materials for around $130,000, This car gives you nothing at around $180,000. It's almost insulting. The plastic on the dash and the doors is reminiscent of that of a $60,000 car, and while the build quality is exceptional, you have to pay a lot more money to get anywhere near the level of Z06 wow factor. This generation has an analog tachometer, which is going away, but everything is driver focused and driver centric. The visibility is really, really good in here for a sports car. There's a cargo shelf in the back where the rear seats are deleted to store things, and the frunk is enormous for a car of this type. It feels very easy to see around you, and you don't feel as claustrophobic as you do in the Corvette. But with all of that said, we know the pros and cons. Let's talk tech. You can't do a video comparison on two cars like this, Jack, without talking about the technical side and engineering. And while these might look very similar in terms of what they're trying to achieve, nothing could be farther from the truth. We're going to give you an express look at the differences between the Z06 and GT3, but where do we start?
Let's start with the C8 Z06. This car is a fixed aero, high revving V8 track focused vehicle, but it has a very different philosophy than the GT3. This car is all about the broadest bandwidth possible. What I mean by that is they didn't want to compromise street livability for a pure track car experience with a stripped out minimalist interior and maximum road harshness. This car had to be all things to all people. This car has to be a convertible in some cases, and it has to be a coupe or a target top. You can get this vehicle with softer suspension or harder suspension when you go to the Z07 package. It's built in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and it goes on the same assembly line as the standard C8 Stingray. It has the same basic suspension architecture. In fact, it uses the same double wishbone suspension, the identical hardware. However, the body is radically different. It's much wider. It's over 3.5 inches wider for the bigger wheels and tires, and all of the coolers in the front and in the rear of this vehicle. It also has a far more aggressive aero package. So in the standard Z06 guys, it makes a little over 300 pounds of downforce, but when you get the Z07 package like this car with a giant carbon wing and the canards in the front, at near its VMAX, it makes 734 pounds of downforce. They consulted nearly every engineer that they had, and this is the most aero-capable car that they've ever made, at least for a Corvette street car. When it comes to suspension design, they did not go to spherical bushings. They went with rubber bushings. They're still much stiffer than you get in the standard C8 Z51 car, and the ride frequency is much stiffer. So in the standard Z06, you get 30% stiffer ride frequency. When you go to the Z07 package with the Cup 2R tires that come as standard, you get nearly 40 to 45% stiffer. But that NVH doesn't all make its way into the cabin. They also didn't go to thinner glass, and they did not strip out all the sound deadening. Because the sound deadening remains, and the car sounds so magical, at least on the outside, they had to unfortunately add ASE, or active sound enhancement. So they delete some of the unwanted frequencies, but they also add in some fake engine noise, which is a little bit of a disappointment. When it comes to braking, here's a big difference between this and the GT3. It is e-boost, also known as brake-by-wire. So the feedback loop in the pedal is digital. While there is a hydraulic backup, and there is obviously a hydraulic component to the braking system in this car, it is a digital pedal. You get two different brake options in this car. When you go to the Z07 package, you get carbon ceramics as standard there, built by Brembo. They are absolutely massive, and they are absolutely a massive hit to your wallet if you have to replace them. They're like $20,000. The car has two tire packages. Standard car comes on Pilot 4S's. The Z07s come on Cup 2Rs as standard. They're 275 fronts, and the biggest rear tires I've ever seen at 345s. It has the same steering rack as a standard C8. However, it has been modified or reprogrammed. It is a VGRS rack, and it has a E-diff in the rear with PTM. An E-diff is a basically hydraulic pump in the rear that can change the parameters of the differential based upon all the different drive modes, and PTM is GM's Performance Traction Management Mode, so it's a variable ESC that allows you a little bit more leeway and potential more approachability to the car. Drivetrain's the big thing. Everybody knows this car for the LT6. The LT6 is GM's first flat plane crank V8. It makes 670 horsepower, and let's be clear, it is faster than the GT3 in a straight line. You're looking at a quarter-mile time in the mid-10s and 0 to 60 in the mid-2s, and it does it nearly every single time once the tires come up to temp. It's very, very impressive, and it makes more torque. And it does not have ITBs. It is a variable intake manifold that makes sure you have peak torque at all times. The gearbox is a 8-speed Tremec unit that GM helped co-develop. It has a very similar design that the standard C8 C51 has, however it does have internal changes. The one thing to note is about the philosophy of the gearbox. It had to be as fast as possible at all times, and that's what they prioritized. So depending on what the car is doing, they're looking at slip angle, and they're making sure the shifts don't interrupt the driving experience so it doesn't suddenly break the rear end loose, but they also want to be able to bump shift you or force the car forward when they see an opportunity to do that, to get the car to go around the track as fast as possible. But with that, Mark, I think it's time for us to talk about the GT3.
Let's do it.
Mark, we're underneath the 911 992 generation GT3 with PDK, PCCBs, PASM, of course, PSM.
Wow, could you tell me anything else from the Porsche University? Did you get your PhD yet?
I did, and in fact, I'm pretty sure I've spent so much time with my Porsche reps at this point where they probably won't return my future calls.
They're gonna fire you, and you don't even work there. Let's cover it, Jack. What makes the GT3 special?
What makes the GT3 special and really unique versus the C8 is the 911 model lineup is so vast that there is a 911 for every purpose. And as our Porsche reps remind us frequently, is cost is no option or no issue for a Porsche buyer. So if they want the everyday car, they'll get a regular 911. If they want the hardest core 911, they'll get the GT3 RS with active aero, but if they want the car that allows them to feel everything, has an optional manual gearbox, something you can't get in the C8, and a car that can do track duty and street duty, you get the GT3. This is on the Carrera body, so it does not have a wide body. It has lightweight glass, a reduction in NVH material in the cabin, and it is overall lighter than the Z06. This car, just like the Z06, employs a body structure of aluminum and composite materials. This car also comes in two different body styles. While you cannot get this as a convertible, you can get this as a coupe or a touring. They are mechanically identical, and the coupe has a wing. So the total downforce number of this car is 850 pounds at 177, 180 miles an hour, which is 100 pounds more downforce than the Z06.
It also differs itself from the Z06 by having adjustable aerodynamics via front spats, and of course the rear wing is adjustable, and they must be adjusted together to maintain that aero balance that they designed in.
Suspension. This is on the MMB platform of 911, but unlike the standard 911s, this car gets double wishbone front suspension. They essentially have an entirely different front subframe for this car. The car also implements spherical or ball joint style bushings. So again, more of that NVH makes its way into the cabin. You have more feel out of this, but it does ride rougher. And the suspension is entirely adjustable, including sway bars. So you get height adjustability, you get camber caster, and the sway bars can be made to make this car push a little more or push a little less. The sway bars are non-adjustable on the Z06.
The dampers also are traditional, well, as traditional as you can get. They are not MagnaRide, that's the point. The Z06 is default with GM's MagnaRide technology and all the software that goes along with that.
Both of these cars have the front end lift installed, which is a hydraulic setup that lifts or lowers the front end as you go over bumps, but you do lose some adjustability and add a little bit of weight there. Mark, this car also has rear steer as standard, an option that is not available on the Z06. Walk me through what rear steer does.
It changes the wheelbase of the car electronically by towing in or out the rear wheels to give you that better turning radius in slower speed and making the car more direct at higher speed or more stable. Well, it doesn't really lengthen or shorten the wheelbase. That's the goal of the electronics by turning the rear wheels. It is a big differentiator, with this car versus the Z06, aside from the fact that it's rear engine versus mid-engine.
But the static weight balance of both of these cars are remarkably similar. It's 40-60. The other thing to talk about, Mark, of course, is drivetrain. You get two different gearbox options. You can get a manual, which if you want a manual experience, you have to buy a GT3. There's no manual in the Z06. Or a 7-speed dual clutch, a PDK. It is amazing. We've beat it to death at this point. It gets an e-diff just like the Z06. However, if you get a manual, this gets a traditional mechanical limited slip differential in the rear. The engine, both of these engines, both in the Z06 and this 4-liter flat 6 in the GT3, are both dry sump engines, and they are hand assembled. In fact, I have actually met the builder who built the engine in that Z06, the press car we have. And it's the same engine builder as my personal car.
I was waiting for it. This guy can't do a video without mentioning his Corvette. So how does this make you objective, Jack? You own a Corvette. Of course the Z06 is going to win, right?
The 4-liter in this GT3 makes 500 horsepower, and it is essentially identical to the Cup car engine, obviously other than exhaust and some ECU calibrations. The LT6 in the Z06 shares most of its componentry with the LT6R found in the C8R race car. However, obviously has a different intake manifold. It doesn't have ITBs like this car has, or the LT6R, and it makes more power than their race car.
It's an interesting difference in methodology of how they designed both engines, where they are motorsports derived and they were co-developed with the motorsports team. I think that's the key takeaway. You can argue why and how they did the tuning for street versus track, but they're both taking the same philosophy of motorsports durability and excitement and passion and injecting it into a street car.
Mark, last thing to talk about is you got to slow down all this power. So we have to talk about brakes. You have two options in this car. You have the carbon ceramics, the PCCBs, or irons. They are amazing. They're built by Brembo. And unlike the Z06, they are not brake-by-wire. You get a hydraulic feedback through the pedal, which means you have a perfect idea of what the brakes and the tires are doing. Wheels, these are center lock. You can get them as essentially one option, a forged wheel. But unlike the Z06, you cannot get an optional carbon fiber wheel that our vehicle has, which helps shave 44 pounds of unsprung mass.
That's a lot.
Yes, this car comes standard with Cup 2s. However, there is a dealer-installed option of Cup 2Rs. The Cup 2R tire takes the carcass of a street tire with the rubber compound of a Michelin Slick. Main thing to know is they are amazing. They can pull ridiculous Gs, tremendous lap times, and they have high consistency. But Mark, I think it's time for us now to take these vehicles around Autobahn Country Club.
Oh boy, let's do it.
Z06, Mark, Z07.
You're not breaking any quarter-mile records with that launch, Jack.
No, and I will be honest, Mark, we are on cold Cup 2Rs right now on Autobahn South. And the first thing I want to talk about is
There's no place for me to hang on to. Oh, I'm gonna hold on to these little vents.
no, it's the LT6, 5.5 liter. We've talked about it a ton at this point. The big difference, other than the way it sounds compared to the GT3, is the way it feels. It kind of feels more, I hate to say savage, but savage, it has more torque corner exit. So as you unwind the wheel and straighten the car out, and deep press on the gas, corner exit, it feels like there's more power there. Gearbox, I'm in full manual mode, and I'm going to see if I can get it to do a bump shift. There you go. That was a bump shift. Dynamics, Mark. I guess, you know, the engine's one thing. Obviously, it's what you feel the most when you drive a Z06 for the first time is this visceral sound behind your head. But
It's all dominated by the engine.
Yeah,
I know we said this
100%.
before, but I mean that's where this car is a standout. I mean it's a standout in a lot of ways. The gearbox is really good, but I mean you really live to rev this car out.
The dynamics of steering, I think, is the first thing to talk about. It is hyper direct, and you can make micro corrections of the wheel. You can feed in and out steering, and you know exactly what the front end is doing in this car. But I will say, when it comes to actual feedback, there's almost like a squishiness in the steering inputs. You can feel like there's more rubber in the front end of this car. The steering is, you know, you've heard it from other outlets, you're gonna hear it from us, it's largely lifeless. It is extraordinarily direct. You know exactly what the car is doing, but it feels like there's a layer of insulation to it.
Yeah, the variable rack, it makes this feel very quick in the front end, but there is like a step of a bit of a delay in reactivity before the car really gets set. And it's strange because I think it's because the front is so quick that there's just a little bit of delay before the whole car gets settled. But it takes time to get used to it. Every car is different. I would say once you get used to the behavior, it feels very natural. It's very rear-wheel drive feeling. You know, under braking, the car trail brakes. When you're going flat out and you're turning in, the car rotates just beautifully. You just have to get used to the way that the chassis is set up, the way that the mid-engine feel is. You can't overwork the front end. You can't just ramrod this into the corner in the front. You're not going to get out of corners. So it's a little bit of an adjustment.
I will say the brakes, well, we talk about it because it's an e-boost setup. The one thing is it is nearly perfectly calibrated with how much pressure, how much braking you get.
Yeah.
But as a mechanical feedback loop through the pedal, it's something that is absent from this car. It's very linear, it's very progressive, but I feel like it doesn't give you the confidence level that a more traditional, it's called hydraulic setup has. Not saying that it won't stop you or bring you down and it doesn't have high thermal capacity. It clearly does.
I think that there's not an issue with the brake capacity.
Yes.
What it is it catches you off guard because you can't figure out where the threshold of the brakes are. So coming hot into a straight, into a braking zone, I will brake way deeper than I think the car can go, and it's in ABS, so it's really hard to modulate where that braking zone is and how far you can go compared to some of the other cars without, you know, this brake-by-wireness. So you can't feel it, to your point, but it's mostly in the late braking zones where you're like, it really catches you off guard, like, oh shit, I gotta back off the brakes a little bit on this car to find where that zone is.
How do you feel about chassis dynamics? We talked about steering, we talked about engine, we talked about gearbox. How does this car actually drive?
I mean, I think what's incredible about the Z06 is that you can do what we're doing here. You can feel the life of the car, the engine. You feel a lot where it's not going to kill you on the street. It doesn't feel like it's beating you up to drive. It's not a lot of work to drive this fast. So there's like obviously you can push this like a race car driver and get an insane amount out of it, and you can still reach high limits being a novice. And it's really accessible with all the drive modes. You can still go fast without it being scary, and a lot of that is because of electronics, of course. But the chassis is really, really communicative about what it's doing and when it's letting go in the back.
I think the way I would describe the dynamics of this car, the first 8/10ths, it's probably easier to get up to those first 8/10ths in the Z06 than it is the GT3. The last 2/10ths, because of some of the compromises it made to be a better street car, you don't feel as much on the track side of things. And the way the car reacts to turn in, you have to do things in steps. You set up the front end, you get the front end to turn in, the rear comes around. I feel like because the GT3, as we're about to talk about, has a different set of priorities and a different set of suspension systems, they feel, the finer details, they feel very, very different, Mark. But before you drive the GT3, I think it's time for me to send this car off. GT3, Mark. Tell me about the engine. Tell me about this 4-liter.
Let me tell you all about it. I don't even need to say anything, just listen. On cold tires, so I'm not going flat out because I don't want to harm anybody.
You're definitely not harming me with 9,000 RPM red light, Mark.
We talked about this car endlessly, Jack. It's obviously one of our favorite cars for a multitude of reasons. The main being the front end is so amazing now. I think think it's just, it works so well, and with the track alignment, especially in real tires, it's crazy the amount of grip that this thing has. And the big difference here between the Vet, and I hate to say this, is braking confidence. I can go way later in this car and I know exactly where I'm at the threshold of braking performance. Like, I know where I'm at the limits of it, and I have way more confidence to push it farther into a corner. And the car deals with it much better, honestly, much better in terms of late braking than the Z06.
You can feel it. I think it's a mix of the fact that you get more feedback through the pedal and there's less weight to slow down as well.
No, for sure. And then you have the big X factor of what's the biggest difference between these two cars?
Rear steer.
The rear steer makes a huge difference in terms of getting in a corner and maintaining that. The stability of the car is there because the whole entire car is turning, and it just gives you far more driver confidence to push harder in the corners before you lose the back. Whereas the Z06 has the rear classic rear wheel drive, get on the throttle too early, and it's rotating around. This car doesn't really have that issue.
The other thing to talk about, Mark, other than the fact that I feel like the rear steer on this car combined with the new front end of the 992 makes these turn-in motions so much like more immediate than the Z06. The Z06, you have to set up the front, then the rear comes in.
Right.
This car doesn't have that. This is the gearbox.
Yeah, the gearbox is far more transparent. It does exactly what you want it to do every single time.
The PDK gearbox is the best automatic or dual clutch gearbox in the world, and this 7-speed is perfect. It's perfect. And you can tell they've spent more time calibrating it. And to be fair, GM's only had the dual clutch in the C8. Porsche's had dual clutches or PDKs now for far longer, and you can feel it when you drive it.
They have more cycles of learning. And I think the other part is too, and you know, we talked about this a little bit more, I have far more confidence to push this car harder than I do with the Z06. The driver confidence part of this car is one of the reasons why I can get up to speed faster. It took me a lot longer to get comfortable in the Z06. Not that it's worse, it's just different. You know, it's a different dynamic than this car is, and it's the type of driver you are. I love the fact that I can lean on the front end a lot, and that I can push the front end deeper in this car than I can in the Z06.
With everything off, the Z06 moves around more in the rear. It doesn't bother me because that's the kind of driver I am.
Yeah, exactly.
But, you know, I think that's only been transparent though in the last 2/10.
Right.
You lean on the systems in the Z06, you can go faster sooner if you're not, let's call it the keenest driver in the world. But if you're looking for that last 2/10 or 1/10, you can get up to speed faster in the GT3. It talks to you more.
Right. Yeah, I would say so. I would say it's definitely a little bit more connected, but that's also by design. As we're going to talk about a little bit later, Jack, you know, there's trade-offs that both these cars have to make to be street cars. They're not race cars.
I don't want you to talk anymore. I just want to hear this.
All right, good idea.
Before we get into the minutiae of why the Z06 was faster than the GT3, it's important we talk about the testing conditions and variables. We tried to keep this test as even as possible because, to be fair, if you ran this test on a different day with different ambient conditions, the lap times will probably change. So to keep this even, Britt got the same amount of time in both cars, and both vehicles were run in their maximum attack settings set up by the OEM's engineers, and they were both on the same tire model, the Michelin Cup 2R, however in their specific OE configuration. He got two 15-minute sessions in both cars, and we tried to run them at the same time. He first went out in the Z06, then the GT3, and then in the afternoon session, he went out in the Z06 last and the GT3 first. He posted his fastest lap time of the day in the GT3 in the morning, and the fastest time of the entire day in the Z06 in the afternoon. The one thing also to note about this test is how the data was collected. The lap times were collected by track transponders mounted to the front bumpers of both of these vehicles with onboard telemetry gathered by a Garmin Catalyst in both cars. So if you look at the data, what you'll see very clearly is the Z06 is faster in every single straight. However, whenever the track got tight or Britt had to brake late, the GT3 gained its time. So you literally watch these cars leapfrog one another in the data. Britt is a pro driver and he's capable of driving these cars to their absolute limit, 10/10ths, where most mere mortals cannot. With that in mind, Britt, how did the Z06 drive differently than the GT3?
With the Z06, the biggest highlight for me is the engine in terms of torque on initial throttle, and then all the way down the straightaway just has a lot more power than the GT3. And I think as you go to bigger tracks, it's going to highlight that strength even further, stretch the gap further with the lap time difference. The biggest thing I did not like about the Z06 was the brake-by-wire in terms of the feel. Now, I did have to brake earlier in the Z06 because it's heavier, it's carrying more speed with more power, but the feel and feedback through the brake pedal is much different in the Corvette than the GT3.
When it came to the actual cornering capability, if you look at the data, you could carry more speed in the GT3. Why was that?
So it's lighter. It just feels more nimble overall. It wasn't a downforce difference, I think, in most of the places where the cars were difference in speed because it was typically low speed, tight stuff. So the air is off the car and it's mostly just mechanical grip, which I think the Porsche is better. In the video, you can see my hands were way smoother, way more linear versus choppy. I felt like the GT3 had a more progressive steering feel, whereas the Corvette was sharp. You know, it was very reactive, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it just is totally different driving style because of how the car is working on a dynamic side. So a lot of corners in the Corvette, you saw my hands on the wheel go back to straight mid-corner. Reason is because I'm basically backing the car into the corner, so coming off the brake with a little more to add rotation to the car so that I could be hands straight, apex to exit, meaning it just lays the power down a little bit sooner.
You can tell when you drive these cars as well that if you are not a keen driver, I feel like the number you're going to see in the Corvette is going to be bigger, but the number is also going to get smaller in the Corvette as well because you're going to have to slow down deeper. With that though, I think it's time for us to wrap up this video and head into our final thoughts. Clearly, this is one of the most extensive videos we've ever put together on this channel. And needless to say, we've covered what these cars are like as track vehicles, but the reality is neither the Z06 or the GT3 are actual race cars. And most owners are going to be spending 99% of the time on the street. And the truth is, the Z06 is the much better street car. All the compromises it makes, albeit small ones, as a track vehicle or as a driver's car, make it a better street car. It's more compliant, it's more isolated, and honestly, it has a better sense of humor. The Z06 is a car that you can configure as a convertible, or even if you configure it as a track car, you can take the top off on the street and hear the V8. It's a car that makes you want to use launch control all the time, so you can hit 0 to 60 in the mid-2s. It's the faster car more of the time. Yes, if you shrunk down the track any further and you got rid of all the straights, the GT3 would be faster. But on most tracks, and particularly big tracks, the Z06 is going to be faster. It can utilize that horsepower in all the straights, and I do think for drivers who are less capable, the Z06 is going to make them feel like a hero because they're going to see that big number when they hit those straights. The other thing to bring up, of course, is the Z06 is a hell of a lot cheaper. This car, when you equip it with all of the luxury features, can be as much as $100,000 less expensive than the GT3. And that's, of course, before you factor in dealer markup and all that other fun stuff. But I think it's, in many ways, the more attainable, more accessible car.
When we did our first drive in the 992 GT3, I had a strong sense this was one of the best cars I'd ever driven. This is one of the favorite cars ever. Even going back, we glorify the older cars, but the 992 GT3 is almost mechanical perfection of this age. It blends the electronics with all the analog inputs, or as much analog connection as you can have to a car. And when we looked at the configurator when this came out, I was like, how do I stretch this? How do I justify paying almost $200,000 for a car? And now we've seen the prices go up even further. And to me, even if you have a lot of money, you're near that retirement point, or you have some disposable income, when you're looking at spending over $220,000 just to get little things like a leather dash or some of the niceties of the interior that the Z06 has by default at even a lower price point, that's a really hard pill to swallow. So you have to be someone that really appreciates what the GT3 is at its core. And for me, I started driving not too young, but a little bit later, and I got into karting, and I love how the GT3 works at the limit. The 10/10 is where it's superior to the Z06 because it doesn't make the compromises to try to be as much to so many people, because there's so many 911s to do that already, and I love that focus part of it. And if I'm only taking this car out once a month, the GT3 is the car that I would love to just go out and rag on, but that price point really, really bothers me. And to your point, when the Z06 does almost everything at 98% of what the GT3 does and better most of the time, it's become more and more of a hard sell.
It depends on what you prioritize. Honestly, there's not a right or wrong answer between both of these cars. And if you drove either of them in a vacuum and you didn't realize the other one existed, you would think it was the greatest car ever built. And I do think these cars are amazing. So it becomes what you prioritize. Are you looking for a driver's car that doesn't necessarily have the same lap times or metrics? You're probably going to want the GT3, of course, if you have deep enough pockets.
Right.
Are you someone who realizes they're not a race car driver and is going to be spending more of the time on the street? They might want a road trip with the car, but they still want to be able to tear around a racetrack at 10/10. The Z06 might be the better option for you. But again, these cars are a celebration of what engineering can accomplish when you have incredibly passionate people working on the products. The Porsche team and the Corvette team, both their PR teams and their engineering teams, are the pinnacle of the automotive industry.
We're doing this because we love these cars and we want to bring people together to celebrate them, and we understand unequivocally that 99% of people cannot afford either of these cars, regardless if it's $90,000 or $200,000. It's unobtainium, but it's that point of dreaming. How do you work harder? How do you make this happen? And that's a lot about my mentality with making this video and working with the teams that you've got involved. They want to learn the little nuances of how to make their cars better, and they want to connect people in the driving experience, why people love cars, and these two cars embody everything to do with that.
Yes, there's a level of mutual respect between these teams that we honestly haven't seen from any other OEMs. But with that, Mark, I think it's a good time to wrap up this video.
Before I entered this phase of my career, I always wondered why there were not more videos like this available online, at least for free, from independent outlets. Now I know why. They're incredibly complicated, logistically difficult, and most importantly, expensive to make. This would not be possible without the help of the manufacturers that were involved. Porsche and Corvette team wanted to do this. They sent out their cars, the consumables, mechanics, engineers, and of course PR professionals to help us tell this story, to unite the automotive community into understanding why these cars are so special. This also would not be possible without Autobahn Country Club. They opened their doors to us and allowed us to exploit the limits of these cars in a safe manner. And if you live in the Midwest and you want to do a track rental, or you want to become a member or learn how to drive your car better from trained drivers like Britt Casey, it's going to transform your whole ownership and driving experience, and it really has made a difference to Jack and I. The last thing to say is, again, money. right? Patreon helps to subsidize some of these insanely difficult videos. Without them, without the supporters there, we would not be able to do this. So a big thanks to them. If you want to join, help donate to us, definitely hit that up. If you want to subscribe, those numbers help us to pitch manufacturers on future projects. Believe it or not, the numbers matter. Thank you again for taking your time to watch this video.